Okay, hello everybody and welcome to class today. It is May 1st, 2020, new month. And today we are talking about just the last part of conservation in human modified landscapes, which is conservation in urban landscapes. And so, I forgot to change this slide, I'm sorry, but video 1 still applies, as does the mini assessment 1, but that second video is actually a video on a Texas community that is working to provide connectivity through their city. And you might say, why Texas? That's totally random. It's because this video the people who speak in this video do a really good job of articulating exactly the benefits of making wildlife habitat connectivity through cities, both for wildlife and for people. So I really like that video and I hope you enjoy it too. I also am going to put up a video that's really just for fun. It's optional, but it's wildlife taking over the streets of cities during the coronavirus pandemic. With people inside, wildlife are coming out more and exploring. So it's kind of interesting to see. Okay, so Eileen was kind enough to tell me that every time I say I'm moving my head out of the way so you can see something, it's actually not moving at all for you guys. So I'm just going to make my head up here a little smaller than normal so you can see the slides better. So we talked about, this is a slide from the lecture on Monday, basically talking about conservation in human modified landscapes and how, you know, the original idea of conservation was like, let's protect all the pristine areas that are left. Let's protect the wilderness that remains. But that's really not possible anymore in a world where humans have already modified 50% of the world's surface for agriculture and an additional percentage for urban areas, right? And suburban areas and roads and everything that we've built. So if you only tried to protect wilderness areas, you protect a very small percentage of the landscape, and we wouldn't protect all the biodiversity habitat hotspots, and we might not leave any place for the animals to be able to be moved between those protected areas, right? So then we talked about on Monday and on Wednesday this idea of, okay, well, if we look at the globe, the surface of the land as a kind of human and anthropogenic biome. So instead of looking at like, this is tropical rainforest and this is desert, we look at it in terms of like, this is irrigated cropland and this is residential rain-fed cropland. Then we can look at the landscape and say, okay, where do we most need to protect animals in human modified landscapes? And we talked about making agriculture more biodiversity friendly, not much, but a little bit about rangelands more biodiversity friendly. And again, we're not talking about wildlands this week because that's not a human modified landscape. So today we're just going to touch briefly on how can we make urban areas more biodiversity friendly. So let's look at, okay, how much of the earth is covered with urban areas. So in that video with the Texas city that I want you to watch, the biologist, you'll hear her say, well, 75% of the earth's surface is covered with urban and suburban development. That's not true. I don't know where she's getting that statistic from. Everything else in the video is good, but I think that she's kind of referring to the fact that even though it's actually about 1 to 2% of the surface that's actually covered with urban or suburban, the percent that is covered really effectively chops up all the areas that are not covered by urban development. So this is a picture of the earth at night. You've probably all seen this before. If you haven't, I've seen it a million times and it's always still really impactful to me. So you can see the vast stretches of the planet that still don't have a lot of lights on at night. Now that doesn't mean people don't live there. They just might not have reliable electricity. But you can see that, like, especially certain regions of the world, like India, Europe, Asia on the kind of southeastern coast, and right where we live, the eastern half of the United States, are highly developed areas. So it's not 75% of the Earth's surface, but it is a lot of the Earth's surface, and it chops up or dissects a lot of the protected areas. So we are humans, we like connectivity, right? We like to be connected and be able to travel between cities and between towns. And so all those little dots that are lights, which are developments, we know are connected by roads, right? So all the little places within those lighted areas that are not right, like more natural areas, are isolated by our development. So actual urban land cover is a small percentage. It has a big impact because it chops up these other land types. And so remember from last week when we did conservation planning that connectedness is important for habitat. So I took this slide literally just from that lecture where we were talking about protected areas that are connected by habitat are more likely to sustain healthy wildlife and plant populations in the long term. And I showed you this picture of the Mesoamerican Biological Corridor, where you can see in green. So this is southern Mexico and then Guatemala all the way down to Panama. And the green are protected areas and the red are biological corridors. And you can see that without the red, a lot of these little green areas would be totally isolated, right? So here's the biological corridor I worked in for my PhD work, this one here. So without that one, this reserve, the Indio Maiz Biological Reserve, would be completely separated from the Braulio Carrillo National Park in Costa Rica. So what happens if you're a wildlife or plant population that's isolated on like a habitat island? Well, we know what happens. We've already looked at this, right? When you live in a small population like that, you get threats from inbreeding, which is like a long-term degradation of your population because there's no one new to mate with, essentially. And you're also more likely to be wiped out by a random event. So if you have less genetic diversity and a disease comes through, you're less likely to have an individual by chance that can survive that disease. Or if you have a small population, you're all in one place, and then there's a big drought that year, every individual in that species could die. So the important thing is to have connectivity, to protect these areas, but to also have them connected to other protected areas so that wildlife and plant populations can still migrate. What about, so coming back from Mesoamerica to our general region of the eastern United States, like you can see in that world map of the Earth at night, we have a high concentration of urban and suburban development. So how can wildlife, but zoomed in like this, you can see that there's a lot of dark areas too, right? So how can we make sure that those areas stay connected? So it's important for them to stay connected, not just because of the threats to small populations, but also because of increasing recent threats like climate change, right? So this map is very colorful, very interesting. It was created by the Nature Conservancy and some researchers at the University of Washington. And this is a screenshot, but it's actually a GIF. So if you go to that website down there, you can look at migrations in motion, and it's really interesting. These researchers took data from hundreds of thousands of studies that tracked wildlife moving over time. So you can see they have mammals, birds, and amphibians. You can see that down here. And they use that tracking data to build this overall map that shows where the movement is. And so what I want to show you here is just that, just like we have this really dense human population on the East Coast, it's also a really important corridor for a lot of wildlife species to move through this region, right? So there's a high need for connectivity, and especially under climate change. Why especially under climate change? Well, you may have heard this before, but as you know, we talked about this a little bit when I asked you those questions about like how will the Adirondacks be affected by climate change? Oh, some bird species will move their ranges further north as it gets warmer. That is not just those bird species and not just the Adirondacks, but all across the world, right? So many species, as it becomes warmer, they're experiencing range shifts. So instead of their range stopping at Tennessee, it moves north to Pennsylvania, and then they're able to survive the winter in New York and then in Ontario. So they simultaneously, then it's too hot for them in Tennessee, right? They can't survive there anymore. So how are we going to make sure that as climate change continues that species can move? Well, this map here is from a paper that was published in 2018 by Jenny McGuire. And basically, in this paper, what they did was look at like, okay, to what degree are animals going to be able to move given current protected areas? And if you look at this map, what the blue is showing is like, okay, these areas, there's so much natural area around them that as the climate warms, animals will be able to move north just by moving through existing natural areas. But the areas in orange aren't connected enough. They're split up enough by agriculture and by urban development and roads that if you don't create new wildlife habitat corridors, the animals and plants aren't going to be able to move from those protected areas to other protected areas that better suit their climatic needs. So if you look up where we are, it's really interesting, right? We see the Adirondack Park, and then we see all of these areas around the Adirondack Park that will only succeed with corridors. And so it shows the need for establishing wildlife corridors. Now, of course, they stop at the US border. Wildlife doesn't stop at the US border. Plenty of wildlife and plants even cross the St. Lawrence River, right? Mostly down in the Thousand Islands region. Okay, so basically what they're saying is if corridors allowed movement between all natural areas, species living in 65% of natural areas could track their current climates. Now, not to be a downer, but you might notice that the Adirondacks is gray, which means never succeed. The reason for that is because the Adirondacks is a boreal ecosystem, and the next closest boreal ecosystem is Algonquin Provincial Park in Canada. So as a protected area, right? There's some boreal ecosystem before that, but it's like all agriculture in Ottawa and stuff. So it's a little challenging in the Adirondacks to ensure that there's connectivity with other boreal habitat. But okay, it's not impossible. So we have a high concentration of development, like I showed you in that previous slide, but we also have a lot of areas. And in this map that is here on the right, you can see, okay, this is from the Wildlands Network. It's an organization I work with a fair amount because I'm on the board of this organization called Algonquin to Adirondacks, which is actually working to maintain connectivity in that region. So the Wildlands Network has a mission similar to ours, and what the Wildlands Network has done in this map is identify, okay, here are the already protected areas, the Wildway core areas. And just for reference, you can see us up here. Here's the Adirondacks, and here's Algonquin Provincial Park. And then they have these gray areas that say Wildway corridor areas. Now, those aren't all established protected areas, but they're areas that this organization has said we should prioritize so that despite all of this development, animals can still move through those areas using these wildlife corridors. Now, some of these wildlife corridors actually go through towns and sometimes through cities. How the heck do you do that? Well, so now we're getting into like, what are some solutions to these problems? Well, there's some really cool solutions out there. So overpasses, right? So wildlife, so maybe you're not in a downtown city, but you're in the outskirts of a city, right? And so you want to provide a way for animals to skirt around the city, but still be able to travel north or west or east, wherever they want to go. You can create these wildlife overpasses. This one is in the state of New Jersey, not a state well known necessarily for its wildlife, but here's a really nice overpass structure. So the wildlife that passes through here, it's not a human overpass, so it's fully vegetated so that it's just like their natural habitat and they can recognize it and move through it. There's tons of these all over the country, including some really dramatic ones out west. You should Google like wildlife overpasses and crazy ones come up. But I wanted to show you ones for diversity of species. So here's one that would be good for a lot of different species. Here's one that's like specifically for these crabs in Australia. that a highway was built through their main migration route from one body of water to another. And so they built this crab migration structure, and it worked. This population has remained stable. Plus, it's hilarious to look at the crab migration. And then over here, this migration, or this overpass, is actually designed for an endangered squirrel species in Australia, but in this picture, so it has a motion sensor camera, because biologists always want to know, are these working, right? And this motion sensor camera was activated by these two cockatoos who sat down on it. But if you can imagine, a little squirrel can cross over that bridge over the highway, and so those two habitat areas remain connected, right? You can also do underpasses under the highway, right? So you can do them for an animal even as big as an elephant. And this picture is from a highway in Kenya where they built an elephant culvert, and those elephants are actually using the culvert passing through there. This bear, the grizzly bear, that's out in Montana. There's a habitat corridor called the Yellowstone to Yukon, where they're trying to maintain connectivity for grizzly bear populations. And this is another picture detected by a motion sensor camera of a bear using the culvert. And you can make these for tiny little guys too. This picture up on the top right is a turtle underpass under train tracks. So basically, they put the underpass connecting two wetland areas, and then instead of getting smashed on the tracks, because they're not fast enough to move when the train comes, the turtles will pass through this underpass and be fine. They might end up being deaf or something if a train goes over there, but maybe not. So in any case, underpasses, culverts, right, or overpasses can be built for a wide variety of species, and you might think initially like, oh, they'll never use that, but it's been demonstrated through remotely activated cameras in many of these structures that they're definitely used. Let's look at it. I have a couple examples up here of like, okay, those are outside of cities generally, connecting habitat patches that are bisected by roads. But what about giving wildlife like a manageable way to pass through or even live in cities? So here's a really interesting idea from Oslo, Norway, the bee highway. And so 30% of Norwegian bees are endangered, and so the government started this initiative to have a bee highway in this capital city of Oslo. And there's the city of Oslo, like you can see in this map, it's surrounded by a lot of agricultural areas, and it's on the coast. So they didn't want the city to be something that blocked bee populations from moving north or south to different agricultural regions where they're needed for pollination. So they created this green highway, the bee highway. Well, what they did was like, you could get one of these, you could like become a bee highway participant for free. The government would give you this whole setup and give you some training on how to be either a beekeeper or just to have a rooftop garden with pollinator friendly flowers. And so this has been really successful. And you can see each one of these little dots down here on the map is one of the installations of an actual bee hive. And then the green areas are where bee gardens have been planted. So it's pretty cool. They've established this bee highway through their city. Here's an example a little closer to home. A lot of species can actually do fairly well in disturbed environments, but they have like one requirement they need met. And for ospreys and several other nesting raptors, they need a safe nesting area. So as you can imagine looking at that nest, a lot of property owners do not love having those nests built on their property. So even though ospreys can do fine in a disturbed habitat, they need a place to build their nests where it's not going to be knocked off by the building groundskeeper. And so we've started doing this in a lot of places, but Jamaica Bay, New York is famous for their many osprey platforms that are super cool and have had a lot of osprey nesting success. And I don't know if they have an osprey cam down there. I just Googled it and got the first picture, but like, if you're ever bored during quarantine, you should check out osprey cams, live webcams, or any like wildlife webcams are cool. But they put these webcams up, and then it's providing like some entertainment for people as well, and for people to be able to see up close and personal the wildlife that's living right next to them in an urban area. So, of course, having protected areas that allow animals and plants to pass through or even to live in cities has benefits for people as well, right? So anyone who's lived in the city, or you don't even have to live in a city, but just wherever you live, you know that we find like respite and relaxation, and we feel rejuvenated when we go out into nature. And so these areas can be established for wildlife, but they also definitely benefit humans as well. And they do a great job of talking about that in the video, that second video I want you to watch about the Texas city that's working hard to maintain habitat connectivity within their city. So that's all for today. I encourage you to take these thoughts and ideas about connectivity back to wherever you live and start thinking about them. And later on in life, you can start pressuring your lawmakers to think about these things in cities, right? Okay. There's one more slide, but I don't know why it's not coming up. There it is. So next week is our last week before the week that I saved for kind of wrap up and flex days. And so next week is going to be on people and conservation. So what's the role of people in conservation? And it's your last reading, so it's the chapter 14 in the textbook, those pages. You can skip the gray boxes as usual. And then next week we'll have our last workshop as well. So I hope you have a good weekend, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.